So without further ado, we are talking about managing expectations and burnout as a podcaster in specific, but just I think as a creative individual as well. And this session is really about creator well-being. And the podcast world tends to be something that is quite easy to get into, to have your voice heard. However, I don't think that people really realize the pressures that come once you actually say yes to doing something because you have a regimented number of episodes. They need to come out by a certain time. People are expecting a certain kind of content. And I think that often what happens, especially with newer podcasters, is that they feel like they're shouting into a void where they're not really being heard. And then that can add pressure to what they're creating and can sometimes make them lose sight of what it is that they're trying to achieve as well. Um, so basically what we're here to talk about is how do we manage this world of being burnt out, this place where hustle culture is so encouraged and it's almost cool to say, oh my God, I'm exhausted all the time from work, when it shouldn't have to be that way. And how to still put your message out there in the most creative way possible. So for everybody listening, watching, we have with us Dr. Laurie Santos. Dr. Laurie Santos is the Chandrika and Rajan Tandon Professor of Psychology and head of Silliman, have I got that right? Silliman College at Yale University. Dr. Santos is an expert on human cognition and the cognitive biases that impede better choices. Her new course, Psychology and the Good Life, teaches students how the science of psychology can provide important hints about how to make wiser choices and live a life that's happier and more fulfilling. This is particularly interesting and amazing. So your course, Laurie, has become Yale's most popular course in over 300 years. And almost 1 in every 4 students has enrolled for this. This is amazing. And of course, you've been featured in the New York Times, in the NBC Nightly News, Today Show, GQ Magazine, O Magazine, winner of numerous awards. And again, one of my personally most favorite thing is the Popular Science magazine's Brilliant 10 Young Minds. So thank you. Your podcast has had, which is called the Happiness Lab, has had over 70 million downloads. Well done. Thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you. And we have with us Tiffany Han. Hi, Tiffany. How's it going?
Hi.
Tiffany, again, I was reading about both of you and I was like, oh God, what am I doing here? But yes, Tiffany is a writer, teacher, and podcast host. And Tiffany teaches high achievers how to have lives that feel as good on the inside as they look on the outside. And she's the host of the Tiffany Han Show podcast, which is in its 8th year. God damn. 2 million downloads. Tiffany has also been featured in Inc.com, Sound, and Flow magazine, and you've delivered keynotes both domestically and abroad. What I find particularly interesting about you, Tiffany, is that your coaching career has spanned more than a decade, with life and business coaching and branding strategy. And your current focus is on teaching super achievers how to put their striving on a shelf and radically infuse their lives with peace, delight, and deep trust in themselves. I love that. I absolutely love that. And now we get to the part that I won't go through so quickly because it's my introduction. But I haven't really prepared this because I find it really odd to be like, oh, guess what I've done? I'm Sarah Jane. I'm an actor and I'm a model and a singer, and I've been doing it for 23 years now. And I'm an active mental health advocate, and I feel very strongly about it because it helps me share with people my journey with depression and anxiety and how I feel strongly that no one should suffer alone or let alone in silence. Um, this then led me to starting my social media initiative, which is called Figoko, which is the Feel Good Community, which is just meant to have people come together and be inspired together and just sort of live a better life. And then hopefully that will in turn, each one teach one kind of vibe. I'm also a certified yoga instructor, a meditation instructor, and in case you're wondering why I'm hosting this, it's because I'm also a podcaster. I'm a baby podcaster. I've only done 1 season, but it's called the Sarah Jane Show, and it's kind of an extension of everything that I want to do with Pigoko. So thank you for having me here, Imriel, who's listening silently in the background. Um, so now that the introductions are done, we can get into the meat of the conversation, which is, burnout. So I want to ask this to both of you, and please feel free to answer both of you. Is what do you feel expectations can look like as a creator?
Okay, I'll jump in. And thank you for all of that introduction. And it's just so nice to be here. I think that as a creator, right, we may not even realize how many expectations we're internalizing, because all we do all the time is consume things that other people have created. That's what the internet and media is these days. And so we aren't very gifted at giving ourselves grace when it comes to the creative process, because it never feels on the inside what it looks like. We're seeing everybody else's finished product. And definitely with podcasting, the podcasting world has changed so quickly, and technology has changed so quickly that it's very easy to think that there is a right way to podcast. And I find it's often based on the podcast people like to listen to, that this is what they consider like a good podcast. Or for people who might have a solopreneur kind of business, I find a lot of times they are basing their own creative expectations on, say, This American Life, podcasts that have entire teams. And I think it's so important. And that's why I love this event, to show people the range of things that are possible. And also to have conversations like this where people get to say that things are messy in the middle, that what you're actually getting, what you're receiving on the other end is an edited, finished piece. And even if it's not heavy editing, there is editing that happens.
Oh, it definitely has frosting.
Yeah.
It's not a plain sponge.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you've frosted a cake, right, you fill in with the frosting all the parts that look funny. So it's, when you're doing that, you think, oh, it feels like cheating, but that's why editing exists.
Yeah. We kind of Julia Child it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Exactly. Kind of like, nobody's looking. We'll just, nobody saw anything.
Right.
Tell us what you think, Dr. Santos.
Yeah, I mean, I love that Tiffany started with this idea that we don't see the sausage making process in everyone else's podcast, but we see it in our own, because I think that is just such a common issue, right? Like we think like, oh my gosh, I had all these story threads that didn't work, or, I messed that up a million times. I had to do 700 takes, but it's like, pretty much every podcast out there is doing it. You just don't see it, right? And so I think that that's really critical. I think the other thing I wanted to touch on is, I think because it's a new medium and because there's so many different opportunities, I feel like it can feel exhausting to choose a path forward in podcasting, right? Are you going to go scripted? Are you going to go unscripted? How long is it going to be? How many guests? How many episodes, right? And so I think that one thing that happens in the context of podcasting, which can really contribute to the burnout that a lot of us are feeling, is like, there's just so many choices that come up, right? And that can feel kind of exhausting. The second thing is, I think there's not really many limits, right? In theory, you could put out thousands of episodes, right? It's just like your time and your energy. And I think, I know lots of podcasters who constantly feel like they're beating themselves up because they're not doing enough. Right. And I think when we think about, what would be, a good metric to use, we're never thinking of a specific metric of, I want to put out X number of episodes. We're always thinking like, I want to do more. I want to do more kinds of episodes and more stuff. And I want to put out more content. And I think that happens within the podcast space. But for a lot of creators, that's happening in all kinds of different spaces. I want to do more Instagram posts and more social media stuff and more appearances and more. And so I think because we don't have a great metric, a great reference point to figure out like where we should stop, like what's a reasonable amount to feel successful and like we've done enough, we're constantly kind of feeling inadequate, because what the metric is infinity, right? It can never stop. And so that's a recipe for always feeling like you're not doing enough, and can be a recipe for pushing yourself past a certain breaking point. So I think recognizing those limitations of feeling like there's overwhelming choice and feeling like you've never done it, just knowing like everybody's going through that, but we all have to pick amounts of things to do so that we don't get overwhelmed all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, I can really speak into that because I think, again, as somebody who's constantly in the public eye, it's a lot of pressure. And I've been doing it since before podcasting was around, before YouTube was around, before Instagram was around. And it was already that much of pressure. So when these new mediums came about, and you were, in a way, I remember being pretty much forced by my management to be like, how could you not be on Instagram? Like, you have to be on Instagram. And then I remember being on there and being like, but I don't know what I want to talk about. Like, it's not, you're like, oh, just post a picture of what you're eating because I like food. But then after a while, I was just like, well, how much of that can I do? So it took a while, and it took years and years of sort of self-introspection, of understanding where my boundaries lie, understanding how to separate the celebrity from the human being, and sort of turning inwards and then saying, what do I want to talk about? And then devising a kind of plan around that. And I think that I'm a big fan of having some semblance of a plan. Um, I feel like it's all good to jump in. It's great to do that when you start. But I feel like that can also then result in burnout because, like you both said so correctly, um, you can then, where do you stop? Where's the outer limit of what becomes your creative expression to share with the world, and what becomes something that, because you want to keep something for yourself at the end of the day as well. So I think it's very important to have certain boundaries. I mean, in life in general, it's always good to have healthy boundaries, and I think that should extend onto how you treat your podcast as well. What would you say burnout looks like? Firstly, I want to know, have either of you been in a place where you felt burnout, and what has that looked like? Talk us through that.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in on that one, in part because I've been pretty public about feeling like pretty burnt out over COVID, both in my role as a podcaster, but also in my role as a college professor. Like, just to get super nerdy, because like I have a nerdy podcast where we talk about the science, right? There's like actual scientific work on what burnout is. And so researchers like Christina Maslach and others talk about burnout as having these like three parts. And so the first part is what's called emotional exhaustion, which isn't like physical exhaustion. It's not like you're tired. It just feels like you will explode if one more thing falls on your plate. Like you just like, it can't even with anything, right? Like that's the kind of exhaustion we're talking about. The second feature is what's called depersonalization, which is just a fancy way of saying cynicism. Like you're just annoyed at the people around you, especially if you're in a kind of a client-facing role or in your sort of service industry. Like you just get annoyed with the people who used to be your clientele, who used to be your team. You question their intentions. You're just really easily frustrated. You're on like a really like tightly wound like string, right? Like that's depersonalization. And then the third feature is what's known as personal ineffectiveness. Like you just feel like you're not doing your job, right? It just feels like, there's too much on your plate. You're never going to get it done. But even if you get stuff done, what you're doing doesn't have the same meaning it used to, right? Like even if you're achieving, like it's lost its luster, right? These are the three parts of burnout. And when I was experiencing it myself, or starting to notice I was experiencing it, I wasn't like, at the extreme end of burnout, but I was noticing all these things, especially the depersonalization part. I was getting, quick to get frustrated with my students, annoyed at completely normal asks, right? Like, pissy, like you're just like thinking about people in this very pissy way. And like, I didn't like it, right? This felt awful, right? It comes with this whole host of negative emotions. And so for me, teaching about this stuff and recognizing it, I was like, oh, wait, that's that thing that I talk about in my class. Like that's happening and it's happening to me. And I think if you're hearing the description of this and feeling like those things are part of what you're experiencing, the answer is that you need to take some action on it, right? Like you can't just pretend it's not happening. These things get worse over time, not better. And I think the changes you need to make, like I'm actually taking a full year off from my role as a professor. I'm just going to kind of just do podcasting, which was part-time before, but now it will kind of feel full-time, not because I'm adding more podcasting, but just because I've taken some stuff off my plate. I think you need to really revisit your identity in terms of how you're thinking about work and how ways that you can like reframe what, where are you getting your sense of meaning from, your sense of identity? Maybe that hustle culture is something you need to put on a shelf. I see Tiffany nodding because I know this is something she talks about in coaching a lot, right? Like, which is like, maybe you need to question these assumptions about how much you think you need to do, right? And what does that mean? But those are hard things, which is why we need coaches like Tiffany to help us through them. But that was my burnout burnout story and kind of how I'm trying to deal with it is like not to ignore it, to recognize it and try to take some action to navigate it.
Tiffany, would like you to address the same subject, but I also would like you to, if you find a connection between the fact that you speak very openly about sobriety and the fact that you were diagnosed with ADHD. And I know, as again, somebody who is, whenever you're, because I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety, I also had borderline ADHD with my diagnosis, because and it just got amplified with the want to do so many things at one time.
Yeah.
Which is all great because, again, I get to add many slashes against my name: actor slash podcaster slash singer slash entrepreneur slash blah, blah, blah. It's great. Looks great in the CV. But what it was doing to me on the inside. So if you could just speak into the same subject with even just keeping all of that in mind.
Yeah. Sometimes there's a camp in the ADHD world where they're like, ADHD is your superpower. And I don't necessarily feel like that. I feel like my life would probably be significantly easier without that. But yeah, I was diagnosed with ADHD last year at the age of 41, which was a whole kind of reckoning, enlightenment thing that happened, right? And the reason that I finally got pushed into the diagnosis by myself was that I hit a point, kind of a breaking point of like, there's something wrong, that what I'm experiencing isn't normal. And I can no longer manage it myself. And part of the reason that I'm so open in talking about it is because, Laurie, those 3 stages of burnout that you described, and part of why I was nodding so emphatically is I come across so many people who just live there, who just live in those places. And I think that what happened for us, and I know for me specifically with COVID, was that all of a sudden the burden got too large to bear with whatever it was that we were doing okay managing before. Right. And I think for me with the ADHD, that was kind of the breaking point of like, it's too much. I can no longer keep doing this. I also quit drinking about 5.5 years ago. And that was another like awakening of like, I don't think that alcohol is making my life any easier. It was after I quit drinking that I realized I had anxiety, and that like, oh, this is something that's been part of my life, like my entire life, right? It wasn't until I really started digging deep into sobriety and the way that alcohol affects our brains and anxiety, and realizing that this tool, I thought I was using it as a tool, was actually making my life significantly harder. And it was making me disconnected from myself, disconnected from the things that were so important. Part of the challenge, and I think there's a tension in being a creative person and a person who's really enthusiastic and really wildly interested in a lot of different things, right? And I think that probably everyone listening has, like, there's something that makes you want to be a podcaster. There's something that makes you want to be in a creative field, is that we have enthusiasm that is endless, but we really have to take into account our capacity, right? And Laurie, you're taking a year off from being a professor. I'm currently in the middle of what I'm calling my year of no. So I've taken the entire year off of social media. I've actually changed my podcast where I'm doing every other week episodes instead of weekly, which I had done for 7.5 years.
Tiffany, you have an official email that goes out to people saying, hi, I would like to respond, but I'm taking some time for myself. I loved it. I loved the email. Yeah, it's an automated email. It's brilliant.
Yeah. And it's, I hit a point, I think like October of last year, where when people, would talk about social media or Instagram or whatever, and all I would say is, I just need some time. I just wish that I could like walk away from it. And we're taught that you're not ever allowed to step away, right? Especially something like Instagram, which is such a machine, that the algorithm, and we're all afraid of the algorithm and the things and, the things. And I was like, okay, well, if I can be the experiment to teach other people that it's okay, and when I talk about my sobriety, then people explore their relationship with alcohol. so many people I know have gotten ADHD diagnoses after I've talked about my experience and what it felt like inside. So I'm really trying to shine a light on what does it look like to heal, and the really messy parts, and also that it doesn't happen like that, right? Like, Laurie, you're taking a year, and it's like, we'll see what happens. I think people think like, I'm going to heal. This is my healing plan. And in 2 months, I'm going to be healed. And then I'll be able to go back to doing all the things.
Yeah.
But part of the healing is being like, I still get to be valid and worthy without all the things, managing and running my life.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things you said, Tiffany, that I think is so powerful, that's resonated with my story too, is this idea that, I'm sure you experience this, like you're a coach, like I'm a so-called happiness expert. Like it can feel weird for us to be like, actually, we're struggling. Actually, we have diagnoses that we haven't faced up to. Actually, we haven't allowed ourselves to have the healing process. And for me, it's been really important to use my platform to talk about the fact that I'm going through this too, to talk about the fact that, look, I need to take time off and I don't know how this is going to go, but I really need to do that. That's been essential for me, for my students. I think it's been really essential for listeners. I get, emails from listeners all the time that say, thank you for talking about your struggles with managing your time. Thank you for talking about your struggles with kind of like having a hard time putting these strategies into practice, because it makes me feel like, well, if you're having a hard time, it's okay for me to have a hard time too. And so I think that's one of the messages I want to give the folks who are listening today, is that there can be this move where you want to seem perfect on social media, and you want to seem perfect in your podcast, and you want to seem like the expert but being vulnerable and showing that you're not perfect can really humanize you. And I think it can be an important way to allow other people the space to question what's going on with them and to heal too. I think they're all too often, like, we think that this is a space where we have to be perfect and be edited and be, like this, shining beacon of like awesomeness. But in practice, I think showing your vulnerability can be an incredibly powerful way to connect with listeners, but also to just be honest and authentic generally.
Yeah. And when we think about like overcoming burnout, or ideally avoiding it in the first place, just telling the truth about things you're experiencing, there's this softening available. It just makes everything easier. And if we can learn how to tell the truth in everything we do, right? So you're telling the truth with your podcast, you're telling the truth in your family, in your household, with your friends, right? There is this permission to not perform, and trusting that we can both have expertise in a field, right? I don't want to say like be the expert, because there are plenty of podcasts that will teach you how to be the expert. And I don't know, I don't want to listen to those podcasts. But what I really like, and part of what I like about podcasting, is getting to show up and be a human and connect with other humans. And I think what we're all trying to do here is just navigate the human experience on whatever path that we're on, and see if we can translate something to make other people's lives easier. So I like to say that I know very little about most things, and what I think I have figured out today, I will share, but I might change my mind tomorrow.
Yeah, thank you. I think also there's something to be said for sharing responsibly, because I feel that when you reach a certain number of followers, downloads, like both of you have a certain responsibility to speak your truth, but to speak it responsibly, and also with the disclosure that your truth may not be someone else's truth. And that, because again, on the Sarah Jane show, we often there's an episode about trying Ayurveda for the body, but we do make sure that we mention on the show that this may not be the right thing for you. And it's not sort of saying, this is it, this is what you have to try, and if you don't try this, nothing else is going to help. And another thing that I think, Tiffany, you were talking about was sobriety and alcohol and ADHD. And I just feel like tying into what Dr. Santos was saying as well, is that all of this creativity and the regimented way in which we do it is really a dopamine hit at the end of the day, right? It's sort of like, let's get the post up, let's get the episode going, make it look perfect. And it's this constant gamified dopamine hit, which if you keep going and you keep going and you keep going, after a while, your brain is going to burn out, because your nervous system can only take that much. And it's sort of very interesting that you said that about sort of stopping to drink alcohol and then realizing that, oh, the anxiety showed up or the ADHD showed up, because the body stores everything, doesn't it? Because we're just cellular memory from head to toe. And it's just storing all this stimulation and overstimulation. And then on top of that, with all your traumas that you've been through, et cetera, et cetera. And then when you do this thing where you feel like you constantly need to show up and show up perfect, after a while, your body and your brain is going to be like, hey, enough. I can't do this anymore. You need to take a break. So in keeping with that, actually, you guys have kind of already answered what my next question was, which was how could you possibly set boundaries? And I think you guys have given very good examples. But Dr. Santos, I would like to ask you this. Are there any particular personality types or traits that are more prone to burnout?
Yeah, well, when you think about burnout, it's worth recognizing that burnout, at least the way I kind of nerdily defined it, the sort of, a sense of like emotional exhaustion and depersonalization and personal ineffectiveness, it's often really considered more of an organizational like issue or an organizational problem than a like personal one. We think of it as like a clinical syndrome, and some of the features are clinically problematic, right? It comes with lots of negative emotions and things like that. But like, it's more about your relationship with your work and the way your workplace works, right? And I think this is one of the reasons I love talking about this, the burnout and kind of the feelings that come with burnout in the context of podcasting, because for some, burnout comes based on the structure of the work. I do a lot of work, for example, with, people in the healthcare industry or people in the educational industry, where there's like an industry that has its own structures that might be leading to burnout. But I think the sad thing for women podcasters is like, I think some of us are part of big podcast companies and big organizations, but some of us are just doing it on our own. Like, we're creating our own structures that might be leading to burnout. Like, we're creating our own set of expectations and set of norms and things that might be problematic. And on the one hand, that's sort of sad, right? It's like sad, I guess, if there's like some big structure around you that's like prone to causing burnout. But it's worse if you're sort of creating it yourself. But then that leads to a particular way that you can deal with this, right? Which is that you just need to question your assumptions about work and your assumptions about hustle culture and your assumptions about what counts as success. And so I think it's worth, again, reminding everyone that burnout isn't like a personal failing or a personal clinical syndrome. It really is a set of emotions that interacts with your own concepts of work and the structure and the organizational structure in which you work. But sometimes that structure is created by us. And I think for a lot of people listening, it is. And that means we need to start really questioning the assumptions we have about work and what it means and the role that it plays in our lives. And I think those are kinds of questions or things we could talk about how you do that. But I think starting by like identifying the problem is like step one of like, I feel this way, like this, I don't have to feel this way, but I do. And I can make changes to feel a little bit differently. I think that's sort of step number one.
And you have to slow down enough to even know how you feel.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the part where, like, when we're so good at just going through the motions, it becomes this habit of work. And, we create the expectations, but like all of the burnout expectations are completely reinforced by culture. And so that's the other piece, is like, we're often just responding to culture and being like, oh, you want me to do that? Oh, you want me to do that? Sure, I'll do that. Yeah. I can play the game. Right. And when we start doing that, I don't know, for me, probably third or fourth grade. And then we just continue until we hit a wall when we're 41 and can't, stop crying in the doctor's office, or hypothetically, that there's this whole like untangling that can happen. But again, that first question about the creative process and what it looks like versus what it feels like. Oh, it's so like gnarly when you get into it. It can be. So slowing down enough to feel it, and then like learning to trust what you feel is the next thing, because often we're like, but nobody else feels like this. So if I'm feeling this way, then it must mean that I need to work harder. That's what I think so many people in burnout, that's what we try to do, is we think, if only I get a new planner, if only I wake up earlier, if only I stay up later, if only I do intermittent fasting.
One more email.
That
one more Netflix call. Yeah.
That we need to apply the rigor. We need to like apply more rigor and be better at working harder. And then it's so easy also to have that like finish line dangling, that carrot dangling in front of us. Like, if only once I get that, everything else will calm down. But I don't know, y'all, like COVID, right? We kept thinking once we get the vaccine, once blah, blah, blah. And now we're like still in it. And it's like, what if I think it requires and allows for this flipping everything upside down and being like, okay, from now on, or even just for 5 minutes, right? We can start big or go really small. I'm just going to think about how I feel, and I'm going to trust that to be a barometer for other things that are happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I giggled because I just realized that even when we started this conversation, I was already thinking what I have to do next whilst introducing you guys. And then I had to, because I rely very strongly on yoga and yogic breath. I said, and I've been taught this so many times and I practiced it so many times. I was like, okay, where's your breath right now? Literally. And that's become now my grounding tool, because I'll just take a deep breath and I'll be like, I'm here. I'm listening to what these lovely women have to say, and I'm present, and I have something to say too. And I will figure out what I have to do and later. It's not going anywhere. But there was something that came up. Yes, when you were talking, I wanted to ask both of you, do you think that is it fair to say that we don't celebrate enough as well, even the smallest achievements, which is why the burnout can also come quite quicker, because we don't take the time to really celebrate successes?
Yeah, no, I think that's huge, right? I mean, I think, just taking time to celebrate the successes and to kind of acknowledge what's actually happened, right? This is sort of part of the mindfulness that I think Tiffany was talking about recognizing what's going on. I think we don't recognize like the feelings that we have of like, I'm tired now, or I'm happy about what happened. And I think part of that is that then there's two things. One is that when there are real celebrations that we need to like acknowledge and deal with and sort of have the joy that comes from, we miss out on that joy. But I think sometimes then that means that hustle culture can feel like, oh, I got the accolade, oh, I'm moving on, oh, I get the carrot. But if you don't take time to notice, sometimes you don't notice that like that carrot didn't actually feel good. When I hit like episode number 100, I didn't have the, the fanfare and all the fireworks went off, and it didn't feel amazing. It just felt like, I need to move on to the next thing. And I think that matters. We need to recognize whether we're really getting joy from the accolades that we put in our heads as have tos or really need tos, because sometimes we're not kind of getting the psychological hit that comes with those. And sometimes when we stop and pay attention, we realize we're getting a psychological hit from something else, right? For me, it might not be like putting out the 1,000,000th episode. It might be the connection I get with a listener, or like really figuring out that part of the story. Like we're kind of forgetting the joys that can come from the journey, in addition to kind of not celebrating the big wins, like we're forgetting the path along the way that really could give us joy, but because we're plowing through it, we're kind of missing out.
I think that's so, like, for everyone listening, when you think about the myriad different ways you can focus on podcasting and all the options that are out there and the formats, allowing yourself space to explore and find within the process what lights you up is so important. Because, if you think, well, I'm hitting 100 episodes, it's going to light me up. My 413th episode is going live today. And that's amazing. And, I've been doing it for 8 years, and it's like, yeah, okay, well, what's 414, right? It's just so easy to keep kind of going to the next thing. And what I know is that there is this flow that I can get into when I'm recording and when I'm having conversations or doing interviews. And that's what lights me up. And so I know that as long as I keep finding that within the process itself, that I will do a podcast forever. But that also gives me full permission to change formats or structure as I need to, so that I can get back to that flow and that lit upness within the process.
Yeah. And I will answer this question since nobody asked me, but I said I have to share this. But so I went to an event recently where I got a tote bag with my podcast logo on it, and that was the first time I actually looked at the podcast logo properly. And I was like, I looked at it and I was like, oh, I'm so happy. I want to carry this. I'm going to look like a weirdo carrying my own face around. But I carried it. I went out to buy groceries and I carried it, and it made me so happy. So I think that even just with celebrating, again, because of social media, everything needs to be grand, everything needs to be perfect, everything needs to look pretty. And it really doesn't. Celebrating could just mean going outside and looking at a tree and taking that time to remind yourself that you're here, you're present, you're alive, and you're achieving the things that you want to achieve. But we must, since it is the International Women's Podcasting Festival, I think it's important to ask this question. Do you think that, and this is just for women in general, not just women podcasters, do you think that in the current climate that we live in when it comes to women's expectations on women, do you feel that there's more of an expectation to be everything to everyone all the time? And how do you cope with that?
I think the short answer is yes. I mean, I think this is like the fact that we don't have the right boundaries, that we could always do more. I feel like we've talked about that in the context of podcasting, but I feel like that's in the context of other aspects of career, in your relationship, if you're a parent. Like, it always feels we could be doing more in each of these domains, and that means we never feel satisfied in any domain. But I think that some domains pose an opportunity cost, right? The more you're doing in podcasting, you can't feel satisfied with that, because then you feel like you're not being a good enough mom or a good enough spouse or things like that. And so I think the kinds of strategies we've been talking about need to be broadly applied in women's lives, like generally, right? Like across all these other different domains, because I think when you add it all together, it starts to feel really overwhelming. And I think that's something we all noticed in COVID, again, because COVID was this weird pause. It kind of put into stark relief some of the stuff we're doing. I think it caused people to realize, like, wait, I could actually parent at 95% instead of 130%, right? Like, I could do my job and like clean the house at like 85% and like instead of 130%, right? And so I think it kind of caused us all to take a moment to realize, like, we might have set boundaries for ourselves that are A, impossible to achieve, but B, like ultimately not making us or the people around us happy.
Yeah, there's this way that we talk about, like, there's always more to do as this personal heroic battle on like this mountain we're climbing. And there's so much permission in being like, yeah, there's always more to do. And like fully accepting that, I will always be behind on my laundry. Promise. Like, I do not want to do laundry. There will always be more meal planning for me. And I think I'm just thinking about the things like outside of work. I mean, we could make a whole list of work too, but COVID really also blurred those boundaries so that people all of a sudden were like all at home, all working from home. The kids are around all the time. Like, it's like, oh, I can't compartmentalize my life maybe the way that I used to. But yeah, the like relaxing expectations, I often remind my clients, like, I always tell them to like aim for a B+, which is like an 87%. And for them, 87% means that you're 13% deficient, right? And it's like, oh, but I'm so uncomfortable. And I remember in college, when I started school, I was majoring in engineering, and I decided I wanted to change my major, and I went to see the advisor, and he was like, why are you changing your major? And I was like, well, obviously I can't do this because I think I had a B- GPA. And he was like, but you're doing great. Like, for someone who's just stepping into this, you're doing great. But I graduated high school with like over a 4.0, right? Like, that was just normal. And so we have to say, oh, if I get a B+ or a B-, the world doesn't end. There is no permanent record that they're holding over my head. And honestly, what you realize is that you become a lot happier and a lot more connected and a lot more at peace. And then you're able to make better choices about the things that you do engage in, and you're so much more effective. And that's the hard, we think that we have to like work harder and then we get more effective and then we get the peace.
Yeah.
So we have to, like, it's this whole way of living an opposite day all the time.
Yeah. The order needs to change. The
Yeah.
order of that definitely needs to change. And again, even though I don't own yoga, I will promote it. I swear by the process of yoga. It changed my life. And more than anything else, it helped me recognize the changing of this order. It just brought me to my core. And even to the extent that I was in a yoga class 3 days after my father passed away, because there was nothing like that feeling that could bring me back to my center, to help me heal, to just check in immediately, by just moving the body and having the right breath, and then understanding that, okay, what's real here? What's in my control and what is real? Um, but yes, thank you very, very much.
I have one other thing, and I think it kind of takes like piggybacks what we've already been talking about.
Yeah.
When it comes to podcasting, especially as women, it's easy to forget that we're also doing all of these other things. And that was something that even as I listened to you introducing all of us, and I was like, oh, we're all like all of, all these things. And to allow podcasting to be one piece of what you're doing, and know that if you want to podcast the way that your podcasting hero podcast, and they're only a podcaster and they have a production team, that's going to look very different than if you're also trying to be a professor and teach the most popular course at Yale ever. And do research and write and all of that. Or if you're trying to run a business and teach courses and manage a client load, then you need to, I think it just makes it easier to relax your expectations. And then also remembering that when you start podcasting, there's so many other things that come along with it, because then you have to put in your newsletter. Then you need to do the social media things. And are you on Pinterest and blah, 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 like all the things. And so it's never just about podcasting. It's never just about a blog post, right? It's never just about XYZ, but so giving yourself permission to see that bigger picture. And sometimes you have to zoom out a little bit to see all the rest of it. And maybe start with like lower expectations than you think you should have. And then you can build on them as your bandwidth expands.
Yeah. It's like looking at the tapestry of your life. You're not going to be able to appreciate it if you're standing that close to it, right?
Yeah.
You need to step back to look at the details and the coloring and the different stitch patterns and everything else that's on it. But thank you, ladies. This has been absolutely wonderful. I do want to end with a quote because I love quotes. So this is, I did a bit of, I looked for one and I thought this was quite perfect. And Tiffany actually said this earlier in different words. But the quote is, burnout is nature's way of telling you that you've been going through the motions and your soul has departed.
Mm.
And it's by Sam Keen, an American author and philosopher. And Tiffany actually said that. She said it's like you're going through the motions, but your soul's not there. And that's pretty much what I feel, what I have felt when I've been through burnout in the past. So thank you.